Hi, welcome to the channel where we remember the history of our ancestors and never forget our powerful Black history. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. The story of Black people in America is a very long and important one. It did not begin with a choice to find a new home. Instead, it began with a forced journey far across the vast, unforgiving ocean. These first Africans did not know where they were going or what would happen to them when they arrived. They were brought to a land that was completely new to them, a place that would become known as America. This arrival marked the start of a new chapter, not just for them but for the entire country that was just beginning to form. Their story is a fundamental part of America's story, woven into its very fabric from the earliest days. This journey began long ago, in the year 1619. This was even before the famous Mayflower ship brought the Pilgrims to Plymouth Rock. A ship named the White Lion arrived in Point Comfort, in the English colony of Virginia. On board this ship were 20 and odd Africans. These men and women were the first recorded Africans to be brought to English North America. They were originally captured from their homes in the kingdom of Ondongo, which is in modern-day Angola. Their world was turned upside down, and they were forced into a future they could not have imagined, one that would shape the destiny of a nation. The reason these Africans were brought to America was rooted in the need for labor. The English colonists in Virginia had large farms, especially for growing tobacco, which was a very valuable crop. Planting and harvesting tobacco required many workers, and the colonists needed a cheap source of labor to make their farms profitable. They first tried to use indentured servants from Europe and to force Native Americans to work, but these solutions were not enough for their growing ambitions. The arrival of Africans presented a new tragic solution to this demand for workers, setting a pattern that would last for centuries. These first Africans were not technically enslaved for life in the way we understand it today. They arrived as indentured servants. This meant they had to work for a certain number of years to pay for their passage. After their time was finished, some were able to gain their freedom and even own land. One of these first arrivals, a man named Anthony Johnson, eventually became a free man and a tobacco farmer himself. However, this small window of opportunity would not last long. Very soon laws would change and the system of lifelong inherited slavery would become the harsh reality for millions of Black people. The journey from Africa to America was a brutal and terrifying experience. It is known as the Middle Passage. This name comes from the fact that it was the middle part of a three-part trade route between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European ships would bring goods to Africa, trade them for captured African people, and then sail across the Atlantic Ocean. The conditions on these ships were horrific. Hundreds of men, women, and children were packed tightly into the dark, filthy holds below the ship's deck. They had very little room to move, sometimes not even enough to sit up straight, for a journey that could last for months. The people on these ships were treated not as human beings, but as cargo. They were chained together, often wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle. The air below deck was hot and suffocating, filled with the smell of sweat, sickness, and death. Disease spread quickly in these crowded, unsanitary conditions. Sicknesses like dysentery and smallpox killed many before they ever reached land. The food they were given was poor and scarce, just enough to keep them alive. The journey was a constant struggle for survival against unimaginable cruelty, a nightmare that haunted the ocean waves for more than 2 centuries. Despite the terrible conditions, the spirit of the captured Africans was not easily broken. They resisted in many ways. Some refused to eat, hoping to starve themselves rather than live as slaves. Others organized rebellions on the ships, fighting back against the crew with whatever they could find. These uprisings were often unsuccessful and were met with extreme violence, but they showed an incredible will to be free. The journey was not just a physical one, it was a mental and emotional battle. They held on to memories of their families, their cultures, and their homes, finding strength in their shared humanity even in the darkest of times. When the ships finally arrived in the Americas, the ordeal was not over. The survivors were brought ashore, weak and sick from the long voyage. They were then sold at auctions. Families who had managed to stay together during the Middle Passage were often torn apart forever at these sales. People were inspected like animals, their bodies checked for strength and health by potential buyers. This was their welcome to the New World, being sold to the highest bidder to begin a life of forced labor. The journey across the ocean was over, but a new and difficult journey was just beginning on American soil. Life for the newly arrived Africans was defined by hard, relentless work. Most were sent to work on large farms called plantations. In the south, the main crops were tobacco, rice, and later, cotton. The work was physically demanding and lasted from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. They had to clear land, plant seeds, care for the crops, and harvest them, all under the watchful eye of an overseer. The tools they used were simple, and the labor was back-breaking. There was no rest, no pay, and no escape from the daily grind. Their lives were dedicated to making the landowners wealthy. The system of slavery that developed was incredibly harsh. Black people were considered property, not people. They had no legal rights. They could not own property, they could not travel without permission, and it was illegal for them to learn how to read or write. Slave owners had complete control over their lives. They could be bought and sold, and families were constantly broken apart. A husband could be sold to a plantation owner in a different state from his wife, and children could be taken from their parents and never seen again. This constant threat of separation was one of the cruelest parts of life under slavery. Despite these brutal conditions, enslaved people built strong communities. They created a new culture that blended their African traditions with their experiences in America. In the small cabins where they lived, they found ways to support each other. They shared stories, sang songs, and practiced their own forms of religion. These songs, known as spirituals, often carried double meanings, expressing both their faith in God and their deep desire for freedom. Family, even when not related by blood, became incredibly important. They created kinship networks calling each other brother, sister, auntie, and uncle to rebuild the family bonds that slavery tried to destroy. Resistance was a constant part of life. While large-scale rebellions were rare and dangerous, enslaved people resisted in smaller everyday ways. They might work slowly, pretend to be sick, or break tools to disrupt the plantation's workflow. Some risked everything to run away, following the North Star in search of freedom in the northern states or Canada. These small acts of defiance were a way of reclaiming some control over their own lives. They were a powerful statement that even though their bodies were enslaved, their spirits remained determined to be free. This spirit of resistance would fuel the long and difficult fight for emancipation. The importance of Black Americans in the history of the United States cannot be overstated. From the very beginning, their forced labor was the engine that drove the economy, especially in the South. The immense wealth of the early American colonies was built on the backs of enslaved people. Crops like tobacco, sugar, rice, and cotton generated huge profits for landowners and traders, and these profits helped fund the growth of the new nation. Without their work, the United States would have developed in a very different way. They did not just work the land, they literally built the country from the ground up. Their influence goes far beyond labor. Black Americans have shaped every aspect of American culture. Their musical traditions, born from African rhythms and the sorrow songs of slavery, evolved into spirituals, blues, jazz, gospel, rock and roll, and hip-hop. These are musical forms that are recognized and loved all over the world as uniquely American. In the kitchen, their cooking styles, which blended African ingredients and techniques with what was available in the Americas, created what we now know as Southern cuisine. Their contributions are in the music we hear, the food we eat, and the language we speak. The fight for their own freedom has also defined America's long struggle to live up to its own ideals. The words "all men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence stood in stark contrast to the reality of slavery. The long and bloody Civil War was fought over this very issue. After slavery was abolished, the fight for civil rights continued for another century. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks challenged the nation to be better and more just. Their struggle for equality has pushed America to become a more inclusive and democratic society for everyone. Today, the legacy of that first arrival in 1619 is still with us. The journey of Black Americans is a story of incredible pain and struggle, but it is also a story of resilience, creativity, and triumph. It is a core part of the American narrative. Understanding this history is essential to understanding the United States today, its challenges, its strengths, and its ongoing journey toward a more perfect union. The story that began with a forced journey across the ocean has become a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and its quest for freedom and justice.